Hello and welcome to a presentation today with myself, Colin Campbell, and Eloise Sokpo-Pardine. We both work for Sage Glass. Sage Glass are dynamic glass of Saint-Gobain. Our presentation is about the case for daylight and views in schools and the associated issues around controlling daylight and maintaining external views. I will cover some of the broader aspects of school development, school design development, and also learning activities developments over the years. And we'll look at the broader holistic issues of indoor environmental quality aspects. And Eloise, our daylight expert, will go deeper into the impacts of daylight on cognitive function, health, and well-being. So looking at school development over the years, the metric that has remained fairly stable for the vast majority of schools, even up until now, is this based on the single house classroom. And this cellular classroom, while it might have been used for all ages in a very small school, that same metric has been used in much larger schools with cellular classrooms and hasn't really changed that much over the years. It's developing and evolving now, but that's how things have been based. In the early 20th century, it was interesting with the move to be more schools being built in an urban environment. There was also recognition to make sure that children had access to fresh air and the outdoors. And then kind of extreme developments moving on into the 70s with classrooms with no windows at all and relying completely on artificial lighting, and then moving through to passive solar schools and sustainability in schools being driven so that the whole schools and classrooms can be more passive and sustainable, through to having schools now which are more socially sustainable as well, and looking at making sure that the occupants have good comforts and well-being. So if we look at this development in the earlier 20th century with looking at open air schools, this was due to the industrialization, people moving into cities, and it started in Germany, where they realized that they wanted the children to have access to fresh air and daylighting, and this was also to limit the spread of tuberculosis, give them good access to fresh air and the vitamin D from sunlight and daylight outdoors. And it initiated in Germany, it spread across Europe over to the UK here and also to the States. And a kind of extreme change in school architecture was in the 70s, where it was seen that windows were perhaps superfluous to design. Perhaps if you look at the negative side, the limit not having a window, it meant that you didn't have glare, solar gain overheating, and no distractions externally, at least. So windows were looking to become perhaps a norm going forward, but it was based upon the advancement of fluorescent lighting, giving enough artificial light indoors at least. And then in post-millennium, there's been a huge emphasis on passive school design, making use of the sun's energy for wanted solar gain, trying to mitigate unwanted solar gain, and with ventilation through the building, for example, stack ventilation and cross ventilation being utilized as much as possible. And then through to from sustainable buildings to the buildings having an emphasis on sustainability for the occupants aspects, so indoor environmental qualities being very important aspect around that. And the four main aspects are the air quality, acoustics, thermal, and the daylighting and lighting comfort. This has been backed up and driven by a lot of green label standardization and certification from BREEAM, and for example, WELL certification certainly coming in higher education and being referenced a lot in principle for school design because of the focus on health and well-being for the occupants long-term occupying the buildings. And then the European standard for daylight in buildings is still a great reference point. If we look at some of the aspects where the daylight and views are more connected in a lot of guidance and frameworks, we can see that the 9 foundations of healthy building, which was published by University of Harvard, actually puts lighting and views together. And then in the central diagram, quite a complex diagram with a lot of different metrics, but looking at sensory perceptive design, where they're looking at the indoor environmental qualities from a subjective aspect and looking at also indoor environmental qualities from an objective aspect as well, and making sure that these tie up together. Then the Green Building Council recently, with their Building Better for People, have developed a framework for health and well-being, which are really strongly promoting health and especially air quality, and also prioritizing comfort with the other holistic indoor environmental qualities, and also a strong emphasis on the harmony with nature and biophilic design and the connection from the built environment to the natural environment. Other school design guidance in the UK, the Education Funding Association, their Priority Schools Building Programme, baseline designs for schools look at baseline design daylight strategy and the baseline design solutions, and this has been developed along with Cundall. And sort of longer standing daylight design guides from the Education Funding Agency have also really pushed about how important it is to ensure balanced glare-free light to all spaces. Glare is a big issue, but it's sometimes handled in a kind of broad brush approach, which was picked up again at a recent conference I listened to with Crawford Wright, from the head of design of the Department for Education, stating that we have to change and avoid the blinds down, lights on approach. You know, it's no longer acceptable. There is another way to, and we have to focus on making sure we get the daylight into classrooms and learning spaces throughout schools. There's huge benefits to daylight and views, and if we look at numerous research studies, they've shown that from a student perspective, you have enhanced concentration, alertness, and perceived vitality, energy to engage in the learning, reduced fatigue, irritability, and stress, improved overall health, and that includes aspects like dental decay, eyesight, growth, and the whole immune system. Higher learning rates and test scores, and decreased absenteeism, and also promoting that physical activity, that vitality that we mentioned earlier on. And from a teacher's perspective, decreased absenteeism, which is huge, and improved mental and physical well-being, which is extremely important nowadays. So looking at it in more detail with some of the key figures, studies shown that there's been a 15% rise in maths and logic test scores in classrooms with larger windows, 15 to 20% increase in perceived staff productivity in well-designed schools with good lighting, ventilation, and spacious learning areas, a 21% improvement in student learning rates with a maximum amount of daylight, and finally a 13% increase in the attention capacity with classrooms with an outdoor green view. Another aspect which is very important and increasing all the time is a focus on inclusion, students with additional learning needs. And there was a study looking into ADHD and the lack of daylight, and the lack of light intensity may explain about 1/3 of ADHD children and up to 57% in adults. And this may be related to the sun's intensity and the effects on preventing the circadian rhythm, biological clock, and its disturbance. Countries like Spain and Mexico have a very high sun intensity and have been seen to have a lower prevalence in ADHD. And the maps you see, the blue map and then the coloured orange to green maps, what we see here is the lighter blue on the states in the US have a lower prevalence of ADHD. And what you see there is the sun intensity is more red. So that correlates to the states which have a higher sun intensity. So something very interesting going on there with daylight. So this suggesting that sleep disturbances may explain the attention problems in this subgroup for ADHD patients. So let's now look at how daylight impacts our cognitive functions with Eloise, and I'll hand over to Eloise now.
Thank you, Colin. So indeed, what is interesting also for us to learn about and to share with you today are the mechanisms that explain the many benefits of daylight and views that Colin has just presented before. And so we will start with daylight. So daylight, for a very long time, we knew intuitively that it was good for the people, but we didn't really know if there was something in the body that reacted to light and that provided those many benefits. And actually, it was only recently, so in 2004, that scientists discovered a new type of light-sensitive cells in the eye, called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the iPRGCs. And so, unlike the rodent cones, the iPRGCs have less to do with vision, but they are responsible for many neurophysiological responses of the body. Basically, well, they play a key role in the regulation of our internal clock and many other circadian rhythms, like the sleep-wake cycle, the cycle production of some hormones like melatonin, cortisol, and the core temperature of our body. And actually, in order for us to be in a good mood, to be alert during the day, to sleep well, and to be in good health on the long term, we need the circadian rhythm to be steady over time and to be synchronized every day to the day-night cycle. And the only condition to achieve that is to be exposed to daylight during the daytime and to darkness during the nighttime. Otherwise, if we fail to achieve that, it can have very bad consequences on our mental health, on our physiological health. So it's very important for adults, of course, for the teachers in schools, but also for children, for which sleep quality is essential for growth, for health, and also to learn and memorize information over time. So we understand now why daylight exposure indoors is so important, so that we can enable a good circadian alignment. I actually wanted to mention another point, which is very interesting for schools, which is the relationship between daylight and the risk of myopia. Actually, for a long time, we thought that myopia was primarily genetic, inherited, but recent epidemiologic studies have shown that the increase in myopia is clearly associated with the rapid urbanization and with the fact that we spend more and more time indoors. And this is a key issue because if myopia starts at a low age, it has the time to progress. And we need to remind that myopia is a leading cause of blindness. So today, in some countries, like in South Asia, there are some public recommendations in schools for children to spend at least 1 to 2 hours per day. So we understand why daylight is also important for that issue. And speaking about spending time outdoors, well, actually having windows in our space with a good access to daylight can also give a motivation to encourage children to spend more time outdoors, so to prevent from myopia, but also to get more vitamin D, to get more maximum exposure to daylight and good synchronization of our biological clock, as well as physical activity, which we know is has a great impact on all aspects of health. So now I will talk about the views, which are also very important. First of all, I will talk about the benefits of views, and in particular views to nature on cognitive performance. And this actually has been the subject of many research in the field of environmental psychology. And this has led to what we call the attention restoration theory, which states that viewing nature can help to restore our attentional capabilities. And I will explain in a bit more details right now. So actually, we are said to have within the human mind two types of attention. The first type is directed attention or the sustained attention. And it's this key mental resource that we need to stay focused on a specific task during a long period of time while inhibiting all external and internal stimuli or distractions. And so it relies on the high levels region of the brain, so the prefrontal cortex, which actually controls all executive function, including attention, but also emotional response and behavior control. And actually, we use this type of attention every day to solve problems, to carry on plans, to make decisions, and so on and so on. And the interesting thing is that this type of attention is limited and it's subject to fatigue over time. So it's like any other muscle of our body. If we overwork it, at the end, it will become fatigue. And when we reach that point, it can have very serious consequences, like higher distractibility, higher irritability. We are more prone to make errors, to negative emotions and stress. And for children, as sustained attention is the most important resource for learning, a lack of it can lead to some academic failure. So that's why it's very important. So this is the first type of attention, sustained attention, but we also have a second type of attention, which we call the involuntary attention. And this is more a passive type of attention, which is drawn by something intrinsically exciting or appealing. And actually, natural scenes, they contain some specific features that call on the involuntary attention and that do not call on our directed attention. So in other words, when we view natural scenes, well, it holds our attention without some mental effort so that our key attentional capacities can rest and restore themselves. Now, besides the positive effect on cognition, there is also a positive effect on stress of viewing nature. And actually, I like to take this example of this Japanese practice, which is called shirin-yoku, so literally forest bathing. Well, it consists of going in the forest and for a walk regularly. And actually, it's prescribed today by doctors as a therapy to prevent from chronic stress and stress-related disease. And interestingly, there have been many research done to demonstrate the positive effects of being exposed to natural environments versus more urban environments, with some measurements of blood pressure, heart rate, cortisol levels, which are all markers of stress, and which have confirmed the benefits of viewing nature. And actually, when we view nature, it blocks all negative emotions and creates positive ones, like interest, pleasure, and calm. And eventually, we are able to be less stressed. And so if we wonder about the pathway at the origin of the effect, one main pathway could lie in the evolution of the humankind, for the reason that actually, because for the majority of humankind history we have spent our time outdoors, well, even today in the modern times, our body and brain are still adapted to be outdoors, and so we are said to have kept this preference towards natural environments, and in particular towards scenes that contain in the past features like water, vegetation, rocks and caves, that were features that a long time ago had favored the survival of our ancestors. So today we are said to still react positively to this kind of disenvironment. That's an explanation of the positive effect of viewing nature on stress. And this is very important for schools and for children, as stress is linked to academic performance. And some studies have shown that pupils with lower level of stress, so personal and school-related stress, can achieve better academic performance and are less likely to behave in a hostile manner, which eventually can lead to lower performance. Last but not least, so we talked about cognitive performance, we talked about stress, but there are also many other benefits of use, which mechanisms are started to be understood and which I like to still continue to cover a bit, starting with circadian stimulus. So I talked about biological clock and circadian rhythm alignment before when talking about daylight, but actually we forget that views can contribute also to that, and that daylight and views are eventually two sides of the same coin, for at least one reason, which is that to regulate our circadian rhythm, what is important is not the amount of daylight that falls horizontally on the work plane, but really the amount of light that falls vertically on our eyes. And for that reason, it's much more powerful to be able to look out of the window, provided that there is no big wall just in front of the window, but in general, it will be more powerful in terms of circadian stimulus if we are able to see out than being in space with a 300 lux average illumination. So that's a very important point that we wanted to raise here, supporting the integration of views besides daylight in spaces, and in particular in educational spaces. Then to continue on health, and in particular eye health, you may have heard about the 20-20-20 rule, which says that in order to prevent eye fatigue, we need to look every 20 minutes at an object located at a 20 feet distance for 20 seconds. Well, actually, it's because when we are able to look at distant views, our eyes do not need to accommodate, so they can rest. It's like a muscle that needs a lot of energy, and if we are able to do so, it can really help to sustain eye health. So it's true for office workers that spend a lot of time in front of screens, but it's also valid for people in schools. And my last point on that, it's about the psychological effects of the views. We talked about a lot about the physiological effects, but the psychological effects are, we believe, all the more important, because we know we spend so much time indoors today, and actually windows and windows views are our primary way to connect with the outdoors where we are indoors. And this is necessary for mental health, so that we can see what is happening outside, so that we can be aware of the time passing, of the seasonal change, and that we can be aware of what's happening from a social point of view. And for instance, there was a very interesting study published this year by University of Nottingham, comparing the perception of windows and windows views before the COVID crisis and during the lockdown period, which showed that people gave more importance to windows views during the lockdown period because of the abilities of youth to connect them with the outdoors and to have the social connections that they couldn't have anymore by going outdoors, meeting with other people. So we think that it's very important. So to say it in a nutshell, there is more than enough evidence supporting the integration of more daylight and views into our space and including educational space. Having said that, of course, when you design with daylight and views, you need to pay attention to the control of the light and also to the heat that is coming in. And for that aspect, I will leave the hand back to Colin to talk about that and conclude this webinar.
Thank you, Eloise. Yep, just to focus a little bit more on how what's happening with daylight, and if we look at the development of schools over the years, this is some typologies of learning spaces, and on the right hand side, and typologies of teaching and learning activities. And this is some research from the University of Melbourne. And if we look at from on the cellular type A schools running right the way through, you can see that the formal classroom, like we talked about, going way back to the 19th century, whole school in one room, and that these formal spaces being very good for the activity below, for a lecture and so on. Now, of course, it is possible to have group work and so on and have a more agile dynamic to the teaching and learning activities. But more and more, if we look at the typologies of spaces, you can see the green and red spaces utilizing from the formal spaces to the informal spaces, the street spaces, the circulation spaces, the more open, semi-open areas where students are able to choose where they want to be. But then we have a different dynamic with the lighting and potential glare challenges. And if I just try and explain this, taking the lecture, kind of fixed activity, teacher speaking, students supposed to be focused and concentrating on their activity, to the more dynamic on the right hand side. So if we imagine the light coming in, sunlight from the left, with a typical traditional cellular classroom, it's really quite easy to control the light and minimize the glare from a teacher's perspective and also from the student's perspective. However, if we look at imagine the sun coming in to another classroom where it's group work and the students facing different directions, perhaps it's an open plan area where the teachers are team teaching and there may be several teachers in the one space, then you can see that at different points students will have issues, negative issues with glare, and also with negative contrast issues with trying to see other students, the teacher perhaps, the body language, lip reading and so on because of the glare issues. Now this isn't just, of course, in theory, the formal teaching spaces, it's actually like the picture shows below, the breakout spaces where group work may be going on there, or wherever students may be choosing to be throughout the building. And of course it could be roof lights as well, so it's not just a two-dimensional theoretical aspect of the light coming in. The light, which is the daylight, is so wanted, but it's important to think about how that glare can be controlled, so it's giving the right harmony for all the students in the spaces. Another aspect, when we look at the broader indoor environmental qualities, a great study report, which many of you may be aware of, by Professor Peter Barrett from Oxford University. When he looked at the impact of the indoor environmental qualities, they could see that nearly half the impact factors were indoor environmental qualities. And of this, actually, lighting was 21% higher, at 21% of all the impacts, and even higher than air quality, which was second. And then looking at another aspect, adding to the indoor environmental qualities, as Eloise is saying, the importance of the views. What was also found to be very important was the link to nature, and of course that link with the view from the built to the natural environment. So that really stood up as a significant aspect, design aspect going forwards. Now, it's also very important that we, indoor environmental quality aspect, don't forget about the thermal comfort issues and how small differences in temperature can have a big impact. There's a study in the States, you can see the diagram here in the slope going down to the right, that for every single increase in temperature 1 degree Fahrenheit in the school year, the overall school year, that temperature reduced the amount of learning in that year by 1%, which was just a really consistent slope. Another study from Europe looking at the effects of classroom ventilation rate and temperature on student tests and scores found that each decrease in 1 degree Celsius in temperature within a typical range of 20 to 25 degrees Celsius was associated with an increase in the students' average scores in mathematics. So again, for every 1 degree Celsius down, the student scores were increased within a typical classroom day. So if we look at some of the key takeaways we'd like you to have from a design and daylight aspects, looking at the views and trying to foster the health, the comfort, the well-being, and leading to the best student outcomes, we can see that realigning and resetting the circadian rhythms, as Eloise said, supporting better sleep, metabolic health and working memory, and also what else Eloise went into more depth about, the enhanced cognitive function and creativity in certain subjects, reduce stress, the eye health and development, which has only really recently been understood and there's more research needed, and improved physical health, and then the social emotional functioning. And I was talking about the inclusive design being so important, that again, designing to be more inclusive really generally with indoor environmental qualities supports all students and all teachers. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested to know more about daylight and views, Eloise has written a number of articles on our blog, Visionary Insights, which I really hope you'll enjoy reading. There's a great depth of interesting articles and guest articles which are available there to look at. And if you'd like to know any more and have any questions, please contact myself, Colin Campbell, or my colleague Eloise Sock-Popardine. Thank you very much indeed.